Thanks so much, and let's move over to New York. We're the other side of the ocean. Moses, over to you. I think the best thing is you can also say who you are and what you do, and I think it's always know that I know myself the longest period, so I think it's easier that way. Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Moses Gates. I'm Vice President for Housing and Regional Planning at Regional Plan Association. We're an NGO. We're a nonprofit, non-governmental civic organization that does planning of all stripes and all subject fields, not just in New York City, but across the entire New York metropolitan region. We're not an academic institution. We're a civic institution and more of a think tank. But we have a lot of academic crossover, and many people teach and do other research. So we have a really large research report. It's going to be featured in the New York Times sometime next week on our coming climate crisis and our ability to meet its effect on our housing needs and other needs in the New York region. So I wanted to kind of preview that with this group here. This is not public yet. We're not going to release it until next week. So please no talking to the press or anything like that. I would love to hear any kind of comments or thoughts because it's 99% final, but it's not quite final. I'm very excited to be back. Just the time difference is difficult for me to make these meetings sometimes, but I love this group and this organization and its mission, and I really hope to be a little bit more involved. So with that, let me share my screen here. Um, let me try to get it up. There we go. So we have a tentative title, which is called Averting Crisis and Zoning for the Coming Climate Challenge here in New York. And almost more than any other city in the United States, we're going to be facing serious flood hazards in New York City. And, lots of people compare us around the world with your Londons, your Parises, maybe your Sao Paulos. But our most analogous cities are archipelagos on river deltas. We're talking your Mumbai's, your Tokyo's, your Jakarta's, places with a lot of coastline and a real inability to build serious flood barriers because we're river deltas and we would end up backing up those rivers. And we're going to be facing serious flood hazards and climate hazards, not just in 100 years or 50 years, but really in 20 years. This is looking at 15 years, kind of our flood hazards in 15 years. And it's a significant amount of our coastline, and not just our coastline. We have significant amounts of riverine flooding and also pluvial flooding, which is not really even accounted for in here. Just flooding that is going to end up backing up the sewer system. And what we found is we have a very fractured land use regime here, both in the United States and especially in the northeastern United States and in New York. We have over 700 municipalities in our greater region, of which New York City is one. And we outside of New York City in Westchester County and Long Island, which is where we are studying this particular phenomenon. Almost 4 out of 5 of these municipalities are going to lose at least some housing to this flooding effect. So our risk projections are on kind of a worst case scenario. On the high end, 1.6 million people, 1 million jobs, and about 82,000 housing units are going to be about 82,000 units are going to be lost. About 1.6 million people and 1 million jobs will have at least some kind of flood exposure going forward. And this is not just about housing and jobs. As we do our planning at Regional Plan Association, we think a lot in terms of a little more bread and butter kind of things: housing, jobs, transportation connections. And it's really good to have this organization to talk a little bit more about the more intangible aspects of a city and a region and the heritage of a region and how that's at risk also. Places like Coney Island are heavily exposed to flooding. This is from 13 years ago in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. Even Times Square, you can see on the bottom right, has some flood risk. And our infrastructure, especially our subway, is hugely at risk also. So this is not just about jobs and housing. It's about the kind of city we have here in New York, one in which we have a lot of culture, a lot of uh, attractions, a lot of heritage, and a lot of mass transit infrastructure that enables us to visit all of that. But this is not just an urban problem. In terms of jobs, it's mainly the urban core, and we're talking essentially Manhattan, the very dense parts of Brooklyn and Queens that are at risk. But residentially, it's increasingly the suburbs, Long Island, Westchester, that are also at risk. And you can see here the difference between the people and the jobs that are potentially exposed to flooding by 2040. And when you get to the housing loss and what's likely to be lost, it really is mostly Long Island. We kind of saw that map before, and it's the coastal Long Island that is most at risk. And I'll explain why that is more of a problem than other places being at risk as we go forward. So what does this mean for New York? Well, unfortunately, New York and the entire New York region already has a terrible housing crunch. We have over 100,000 people in this study area that are living in temporary emergency shelter, which is essentially means they're homeless. We have severe overcrowding and we have an extremely low vacancy rate. So we have a really big current housing shortage, about 362,000 units. And then exacerbating that, we're still a huge jobs hub. Even in the wake of our current federal administration, we're still a significant both domestic and international migratory hub. And people are still having kids in New York and in the United States. We're forming households at a rate that's well above a lot of the other kind of richer Western metropolises. And exacerbating that household formation and is the flood loss. And those are also future housing needs that we're going to have. So our current housing needs are significant, but our future housing needs, even just in 15 years, are even more. We're having an aging population, which are smaller family sizes, which need more units. There's a lot of reasons why we're going to have this big housing crunch. And the flood loss not only is a direct loss of 82,000 units, it also limits where you're able to build more housing in the future, which further compounds the problem. So we looked at this by county. We also looked at it by municipality, and it is an across the board kind of problem. There's some places that are going to have a little more housing need than others, but it is pretty uniformly distributed. And when you look at the current needs and what's needed to meet these needs, it's really the vacancy rates and the overcrowding that is driving a lot of our current needs. And you can kind of look at it in spatial formation here. New York City is the biggest, has the biggest current housing need, mostly because it has the most overcrowding and the biggest homeless population in the region. But if you look at prospective needs, the story really changes. You can see a lot of household formation, but flood loss in Nassau and Suffolk County, which are the two counties of Long Island, that is not a majority, but a very significant minority of the housing need we're going to have on Long Island. And if you look at these prospective needs, now you see the suburbs kind of start to have a lot more of this housing need in the future. So yes, the current crunch is mostly in New York City today, but that future crunch is increasingly going to be throughout the region. And this is a problem because we do not have the legal capacity to build enough housing to meet these housing needs. In the United States, and especially in kind of the eastern, northeastern United States and New York State in particular, we have very, very strict local control of land use. We don't really have any state requirements for building housing like many other places have, much less federal requirements. Each small little municipality is able to control its own land use, and generally speaking, they don't like building stuff. There really is a paradigm where locals don't like new construction. They don't like new housing. They think it adds expenses through additional school children, or adds impacts through traffic. It is, I assume, similar in many places around the world. And as a result, many of these municipalities, especially on Long Island, have restricted the ability to build housing. And we did a practical build out of how much housing is allowed under current zoning, and it's less than half of our need for new housing that we're going to have. So we really need to change our land use laws, and we really need to change our ability to build housing. Not even in a way in which we need to invest in infrastructure improvements, although we do. There's some places where the sewer capacity might not be there. But we just need to change our laws, just the legal ability to be able to build housing in many of these places. And this is because especially the suburbs restrict any type of multifamily housing. This is where buildings of 4 units or more are allowed throughout the study area. And you can see it's, pretty much everywhere in Brooklyn, Bronx, most of Manhattan. And the parts of Manhattan that don't allow 4+ unit residential construction are going to be kind of commercial industrial districts. But once you get into some of Queens and Long Island and Westchester, it's extremely few and far between where multifamily housing is allowed. In terms of the amount of residential zoning districts that allow multifamily housing, it ranges between 2% to 5% in the suburbs. And so from this, we come out with the deficit. We come out with how much housing a municipality is going to need versus how much they currently allow through their zoning. And it's significant. Again, in New York City, the numbers pop a little more because New York City has the most current need and is kind of the largest numerically in terms of population in the region. But if you look at the ratio, how much housing as a ratio is needed versus allowed, this is where especially the Nassau County, kind of the close-in suburb to New York, demonstrates that they have by far the most restrictive zoning in the region. I should mention, when you look at New York City, you see that it's divided up. It's not just one city, it's divided up into 59 different areas. Those are an informal geographic division in New York called community districts. They have no legal power. They're not they're not like, say, boroughs in London or anything like that, where they have their own government or legal power. They're essentially used just for geographic nuance in New York, and a little bit in terms of advisory powers on land use. We just wanted to make New York City have a little more detail. So what do we do about this? This is the big question across the board. And a lot of times when we're talking about uh, different problems in urban areas, whether that's our climate problem and our housing problem, whether that's our need for historical preservation and heritage preservation, or our need to grow more infrastructure and jobs, we always tend to present these as either ors, as opposed. We can solve our climate crisis by retreating and adapting, or we can solve our housing crisis by building. We can solve our heritage by preserving neighborhoods, or we can solve our need to grow by tearing them down and building them. And this is something that we really don't think is true, and we really want to try to find other ways to address these crises together. Because if we do nothing, if we have complete inaction, we are addressing neither one, not our housing crisis, not our climate crisis. And so, we think we can also do the inverse. We can take proactive, positive steps and address both of these at once. And in order to do this, we're kind of looking at the different types of areas that are at risk or not at risk, and areas that we think are well suited to grow, have good access to jobs and transit, versus ones that maybe aren't. And you can kind of see, we divided the region up into half-mile square parcels and kind of assigned them these different typologies. And I should say this is something, we've really been informed from a lot of the other cities' approach to this around the world in terms of trying to figure out recommendations. Paris especially, where there's assigned housing targets and housing that needs to be built for municipalities, but there's a limited area that they're allowed to build in, so that the housing ends up dense and transit oriented and more urban. Those are the kind of things that we took a look at around the world as different policies to try to encourage uh, housing growth that also meets our climate and adaptation needs. So we came up with these kind of 4 different typologies and developed 4 different playbooks for them. And in smart growth havens, places with high growth potential near jobs and transit, and not a lot of housing risk, this is where we really need to focus on meeting our, not just the local housing needs, but our regional housing needs, and turning maybe suburbs into urban areas and downtowns. And we have a lot of places that are high growth and high risk. Downtown Manhattan is the biggest example of this. Downtown Manhattan is at very high flood risk, but is also the kind of place where you're not doing buyout programs, you're not retreating, is probably the most important business district in the United States, if not much of the world. So this is where we want to invest in resilient technology and adaptation measures. These are the places where that investment in resiliency is going to be most needed. And if we're going to do that investment, we can also probably have additional growth in those areas. And in terms of bang for your buck, in terms of dollar of resiliency infrastructure we need to invest in for jobs and population and heritage that we protect, these are the places to do it. In low growth, high risk areas, places not near jobs in transit, in the floodplain, this is where we need to look at buyouts and land acquisition and retreat. And then there's also places that, are on high ground but are just kind of far out there, and not places that are really well suited to huge density. And these are places that either, need the least amount of investment, both in terms of resiliency and housing and infrastructure, but might need a little bit of support, might need some encouragement to build a little bit more sustainably. And also are places that we might look to really improve transit access. Are there places like this where we could do an infill rail station and turn them from a low growth area into a potentially high growth area. And so those are, that's kind of how we're looking at the region and our recommendations for going forward to try to meet our housing and our climate crises here. And that's the end.
Right. Well, if I were always saying is that the city is more than a group of buildings, and the metropolis is more than a big city. New York is more than more than a metropolis. So, I mean, you've presented us a massive issue. I would like to try to relate to one or two aspects of it. First of all, is what is the loss of open space, which would be effective to actually deal with this? And what could be then the role of natural heritage and in this open space in supporting this housing? And I think you highlighted it very much about then the relationship. It's not a binary situation between the housing and the heritage. And exactly this is what 11.4, the target of the goal 11, it is in fact using heritage to safeguarding heritage to make our cities resilient. In other words, that is in fact exactly where it is. So the role of natural heritage is very, very important. I've come across then a new concept which has been adopted by IUCN. It's called, I put it in the chat, it's OECMs. So normally we have sort of a very binary things about nature reserves and things like that. IUCN have come up with something else called other effective area-based conservation measures. I don't know whether it's going to be a very useful thing, but nevertheless, it is there. And it tries to look at these large open space, which are part and parcel of our sustainable development. In other words, all these extra people are going to need um, activities, or going to be using activities which heritage can provide so as to make them sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and safe. So that really is my sort of tuppence halfpenny worth on looking at that. And you've also highlighted the second part of it is then you've highlighted the issue of governance, which is really critical. I mean, Heritopolis is together with in the format of UN Habitat with the Metro Hub, and that deals essentially with governance. And I think that um, how in fact we can actually deal with the difference of governance in such wide diverse situations. There's no one system is going to work, and it's going to then it's your gut feeling about how in fact you're going to then have them encourage the municipalities to go a little bit more than the single unit single family units. Anyway, these are my thoughts. If anybody would like to sort of add to that, and then give opportunity to Moses to react. Any more? Yes, Linda. Yeah, that I was waiting for Hong Kong to come onto that.
Very interesting presentation.
We were a bit weak.
Is it better now?
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, both presentations actually, but two hats, Los Angeles hat and Hong Kong hat. I'm a little bit worried when we try to address housing costs, focusing on numbers, and I understand this is not a focus on numbers, how we lose sight of the other qualities that are required for a livable space. So Hong Kong is very efficient in creating housing, addressing housing needs, but the result and transportation and everything on paper is very efficient. But when you're living in this space, the space is not what we would normally call livable. It's a difficult space to navigate. So, and then in Los Angeles, the densification of certain areas made sense on paper, but really in transportation, it didn't make sense. There was just incredible traffic. So I'm curious to know how in this scenarios that you've developed, you've balanced you know, green space, heritage, and the other aspects of livability while we're increasing, we're, you know, providing housing.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me try to go through all 3 points, and I'm also going to share my screen again in a little bit for just a second. I'll start with your points on kind of a more holistic approach to housing. I would say a few things. In terms of infrastructure impacts, you know, that we have a gigantic amount of underutilized rail infrastructure in the New York metropolitan region, you know, much more than Los Angeles. And we recently instituted congestion pricing in Manhattan, which has been very successful. And what it's kind of showed us is, to a large extent, the driving is a choice in the New York metro region, to a much larger extent than in somewhere like Los Angeles or more suburban typologies. So in terms of the traffic effects, you know, that we are a little concerned about it, but we think that we have such underutilized mass transit in the suburbs that's something that we're able to really adjust for well, and also with demand side interventions like congestion pricing. In terms of I also am a little worried about the housing quality issue, especially since many of the zoning reforms we put in place in New York now are essentially to be able to build smaller apartments. And, you know, I have been to Hong Kong, and I've been in Hong Kong apartments, and, you know, they're fun for 2 days, and I wouldn't want to live there for much longer. Uh, it is, you know, and it is a balance. And it's the kind of thing where right now our minimum apartment size in New York City is 600, no, it's 480 square feet, mostly across the board. To some extent, because we're having smaller household sizes and older household sizes, it maybe makes a little sense, but I agree it's something we need to kind of keep a bit of an eye on. And I think we can do that by expanding you know, not necessarily expanding the need for private open space, but we can do it by, you know, building higher, larger buildings with more, you know, private indoor space, and investing in our communal outdoor space, which kind of gets me to Michael's point. I mean, first on governance, this is like full stop a governance issue. We have a ridiculous land use regime in New York State. And we have tried very hard legislatively to give the state a stronger hand in determining land use on the municipal level. We've passed, I would say, some modest reforms in New York State to encourage more housing growth, or sorry, New York City to encourage more housing growth, but the state, the politics just are very difficult. I'm convinced that the only way for it is essentially a judicial solution, is to bring certain lawsuits on the basis of the New York State Constitution and fair housing law. But it's a long road. But it's very difficult to make work politically. So I'm gonna share my screen quickly and give you a concept that we developed here in the 4th regional plan, which was done 8 years ago at this point. So right here in the middle of the screen is the New Jersey Meadowlands. If you look at the right of your screen, you'll see Manhattan. And the Meadowlands are kind of there's some parks and wetlands. There's a lot of industry, like a lot of warehousing. There's a small airport in there. And it's the kind of place that is very susceptible to flooding. It's, you know, some places are only 1 foot above sea level rise. It's the confluence of 2 rivers. It's kind of like right at the mouth of the river delta. And so what we did in the 4th plan is we looked at how we can kind of turn that more into a park that expands with nature. And as sea level sea levels rise, how do we make it into kind of a living park? And that would not just allow us to absorb a lot of that effect of sea level rise, but would also add a real open space amenity to the people in the region as well. You know, it's kind of right in the middle of the region. It's you know, it has a lot of interesting natural habitats, and so transitioning that from low intensity uses that are flood prone into a real regional and urban asset is the kind of thing, you know, we're looking at that I think fits really well with what you were talking about.
Mhm. Okay. Is there I see there's a comment from Vera. Vera, do you want to?
Yes, thank you for presentation, also the proposal. At least I'm talking about something that happens real in Brazil. I would ask Moses if the
Mhm.
plan may increase land use at least close to the park, and may it cause gentrification in this proposal. I'm very curious to understand that.
I mean, I think the answer is, I don't know, but the further answer is, you know, it's not the plan that's causing the increase in land costs and gentrification. It's nature that's causing the increase in land costs and gentrification. If we lose 10% of our residential land to climate effects, you know, that's a real squeeze on the rest of it. And that's, you know, it's not only direct displacement from those flood prone areas, but you know, you do have the effect of a more constrained housing market, higher rising land costs, higher rising housing costs, and more displacement that way. You know, I think our approach is to try to relieve the pressure on that by loosening the zoning envelope. And, you know, I agree that housing affordability and housing costs is not just a numbers game. And, you know, I think that especially income inequality plays the largest role in dictating housing costs. But as kind of planners and as local and regional planners, global income inequality is the kind of thing you know, I personally in our organization has a lot less say in than land use regulations. So we tend to concentrate on how we can adjust those to increase the housing supply and hopefully, you know, take the pressure off of our costs and gentrification.
I saw Antonella waving. I don't know whether that was it was just saying hello to me or that
No,
she would like
no,
to say something.
I don't know where it's possible to raise a hand. So I make like this and something is working. But hi, Moses.
Hi.
Thank you very much. I remember your first intervention in Eritopolis, and you said something that for me was really inspiring because you start your presentation saying what makes New York, New York. And since we work in an area close to Jamaica Station toward the airport, and I remember that it was a flooded area, and speaking with the people that live there, and with our colleagues in New York Institute of Technology, they introduced the fact that for Americans to move, to be displaced, was not so relevant because they used to move their houses, even though in that neighborhood it was for us was really characterized by people migrating from India with specific also symbols of their life and traditions. So if we think about the connection between land use, affordable housing, and tradition in America, how we can deal with this displacement of the people in case of flood, and that is the first question. The second question is related to nature-based solution and the sponge park approach. is a really, technically speaking, is the solution that every environmental engineer propose in this case. My question is about how to define a sponge park solution that really could characterize a place in terms of culture, because okay, I am from Europe, and the symbolical meaning of a public space sometimes cannot be compared to the meaning of a sponge park that is also in our drawings absolutely the same everywhere. So how we can merge the nature-based solution and cultural-based solution to produce a landscape-based solution that really help us to characterize our territory. And finally, in terms of governance in Europe, or particularly in Italy, we are discussing about the constraint of insurance for the people that live in risk area. That for me is the another case of injustice. So our government didn't provide any solution regarding the risk, but constrained citizens to pay for an insurance to protect themselves. That is absolutely absurd, I
So
guess.
let me I'll just give the last word to Moses. I'd just like to say one thing. What would have happened if you'd made the same presentation but flipped the slides, started with the slide which you ended with, started with the floodplain, and then speak about the housing? How would that have then affected all our reactions to exactly what would be done? My second one is then also relating into governance, is that the drama of difference between planning, which is through tort in America, as opposed to the rights of the planner in Europe, is dramatically different. The rights of doing good or the rights of preventing bad, yet the result might look the same at the end. So it's quite unusual. But you have the last word, Moses.
I will try to address all of that. I mean, it's a lot of really good and interesting points. You know, I would say the biggest thing in terms of how do we deal with flooding and displacement and migration in a just way? You know, in the New York region, about half of the people own their own homes and about half of the people rent. And the difference in how people are going to need to migrate and move is enormous. Homeowners have a significant amount of wealth and a significant amount of political power, much more than renters. And so a lot of the ideas of moving, buyout solutions, you know, buying people's homes in the floodplains at market prices, and then they have enough money to move somewhere and be okay. You know, these are the things that are being discussed, but nobody is talking about how to deal with renters, and you know, especially folks without wealth in their homes or other wealth. And I think this is the big question we need to grapple with. We have pretty advanced ideas and even actual programs in place for homeowners, but we have nothing for renters. We have nothing for public housing residents. We have nothing for you know, any kind of other subsidized housing programs. And so this is something that we're really dedicated to trying to think of and to work on, is how do we narrow that gap in a just transition between homeowners and renters. And I also thank you for remembering the kind of what makes New York question. It was you know, I am, you know, a very, very passionate about New York City. And I would say that, you know, making sure that people aren't involuntarily displaced or having a just transition in reaction to that is a big thing. But one of the biggest things that makes New York is its ability to welcome people. You know, it's ability to welcome new residents, new communities, its ability to have people visit, which is increasingly difficult. It's increasingly difficult to build hotels here. And even just visiting is expensive, like very expensive for folks now. And I think when you see the World Cup in 2026, the combination of the expense and also the federal government's attitude towards towards international travel, I think it's going to be a very big story. And so it's not just that need to preserve our communities and preserve our folks. We also need to adjust and build so that we can continue to be the kind of city we've always been, which is the kind of city that welcomes new communities, welcomes new migrants, is continually has that energy of the new. And that's another thing I'm really concerned about. I really like that idea of like, how do we make these climate, the climate parks or the new kind of open spaces we're going to have to adjust a real place and not just, oh, it's climate park A and climate park B and, things like that. And how do we adjust that to our actual natural heritage? In New York, you talked about working near the airport, and Jamaica Bay is a very signature place in the New York City imagination. When we think of going to Coney Island, that's near there. When we think of taking the train to the beach, which is a very kind of like New York thing, it's the beach on the other side of Jamaica Bay. So I think that Jamaica Bay is really the place, and we're constantly adding to the open space around it. We recently took an old landfill and added it and made it into a park. That's on Jamaica Bay. It really is the place where we have the most relationship to nature and to water-based nature, and is it's maybe not somewhere that a first-time visitor to New York would go or even maybe hear about, but it is large in New Yorkers' imagination. And so that's the kind of place I think could serve as a really interesting and good test case for like, how do we, if we can make Jamaica Bay into a real place that responds to the heritage and built environment in New York City, I think, we can use that to kind of scale up the other ones. Mike, I feel like I didn't address one of your points, but I might leave it there.
That's